You stumble over one word in a presentation, and you're convinced everyone in the room noticed and is still thinking about it an hour later. They aren't. That gap between how much attention you think you're getting and how much you're actually getting has a name, and once you understand it, you'll never read a room the same way again. Psychologists call it the spotlight effect. It describes the near-universal tendency to overestimate how much other people notice about us, our appearance, our mistakes, our small stumbles, as though we're standing under a stage light while everyone else watches from the dark. In reality, almost nobody is watching that closely. Everyone else is standing under their own imagined spotlight, worrying about their own performance, which leaves far less attention than you'd think left over for yours. The clearest demonstration of this effect comes from psychologists Thomas Gilovich and Kenneth Savitsky, working at Cornell University. They ran a study that has become one of the most cited experiments in social psychology, precisely because the setup was so simple and the results so counterintuitive. Researchers recruited a college student and asked that student to put on a t-shirt before walking into a room full of other students, people who were essentially strangers to them. This wasn't just any t-shirt. It featured an image the researchers deliberately chose because most people would find it mildly embarrassing to wear in public, the kind of shirt you'd hesitate to put on before leaving the house, let alone walk into a room of unfamiliar peers wearing. The student wearing the shirt didn't get to hide in a corner. They were asked to walk into the room, sit down in full view of everyone present, stay for a few minutes, and then leave. Before they ever opened that door, the researchers asked them to predict something specific. How many people in that room, later, would remember what was on the shirt? Put yourself in that student's position for a second. You're about to walk into a room of strangers wearing something you're a little embarrassed by. Every eye in the room feels, in your imagination, like it's going to land on that shirt the second you walk through the door. The wearers guessed that roughly half the room would remember and notice the shirt. That's the prediction going in. About 50%, essentially a coin flip's worth of exposure, which tracks with how it feels to be the one wearing the thing you're self-conscious about. Then the researchers did the part that makes this study famous. They went to the people who had actually been sitting in that room and asked them directly, afterward, whether they remembered anything unusual about what the person who had just walked in and out had been wearing. In reality, fewer than 1 in 4 people in the room even registered it enough to recall it afterward. Not half the room, less than a quarter of it. The student had walked in bracing for a room full of silent judgment, cataloguing every detail of that shirt, and had instead walked through a room where most people had barely registered a person walked in at all, let alone what they were wearing. That gap, half predicted versus fewer than 1 in 4 actual, is the whole spotlight effect in miniature. It's not that people are unusually kind or unusually unobservant. It's that everyone in that room was there to think about their own things, their own conversations, their own next class, their own minor anxieties, and a stranger's shirt simply didn't make the cut for most of them. Gilovich and Savitsky ran variations on this same basic design over the years, swapping the embarrassing shirt for other momentary blunders, and the pattern held up again and again. The person in the spotlight consistently overestimated how much of an impression they were making, while the audience consistently underdelivered on that imagined attention. Why does this happen? The explanation isn't complicated, but it's one of those things that feels obvious in hindsight and stays invisible in the moment it actually matters. People are so absorbed in managing their own performance and their own self-image that they have far less spare attention to devote to scrutinizing anyone else's, even when it feels like the opposite in the moment. Think concretely about what's happening inside another person's head when you walk into a room. They are not running a background process dedicated to auditing your shirt, your stumble, or your slightly awkward joke. They're managing their own posture. They're thinking about what they're going to say next, or regretting what they just said. They're replaying their own last conversation, wondering if they sounded weird a minute ago. They are, in short, the main character of their own ongoing story. And you are a background extra in it, in exactly the same way that they're a background extra in yours. This is sometimes described by psychologists as a kind of egocentric anchoring. We assume other people's attention is organized around us, the way our own attention is, because our own experience is the only reference point we actually have access to. You know exactly how self-conscious you feel about your stumble in that meeting, because you're inside your own head, experiencing it in vivid detail. That vividness is the trap. Because the feeling is so intense and immediate for you, you assume it must be equally visible and equally memorable to everyone watching. It isn't, because they're not watching, not the way you imagine. Researchers studying this same territory have also pointed to a related pattern called the illusion of transparency, the sense that our internal nervousness must be leaking out onto our face and voice far more visibly than it actually is. Both illusions come from the same root cause. Your own inner experience is loud and constant, so you assume it must be broadcasting outward at the same volume. Everyone else in that room is running their own internal monologue, worrying about their own version of the stumble, and it is almost never about you. This bias doesn't stay contained in a psychology lab. It follows people straight into the workplace and quietly distorts confidence in ways that cost real, measurable opportunities. Take an employee who stumbled slightly during a meeting last week, fumbled a sentence, lost their train of thought for a second, maybe said one too many times while searching for a word. That employee might spend the next several meetings sitting quietly, holding back a good idea, convinced that small stumble is still being replayed by colleagues on some kind of mental loop. In reality, almost nobody else remembers the moment at all. The people sitting in that meeting were thinking about their own to-do list, their own upcoming presentation, their own lunch plans, or the email they still needed to answer. The stumble that felt like a permanent stain to the person who made it barely registered as a passing blip to everyone else in the room, if it registered at all. Or take a manager about to deliver tough feedback to someone on their team. That manager might rehearse every sentence obsessively the night before, agonizing over word choice, assuming the entire team will later dissect every phrase they use once the conversation starts. In reality, most people in that conversation are mainly focused on how the feedback applies to their own work, not on analyzing the deliverer's phrasing or tone. They are listening for what it means for them and their next project, not grading the manager's rhetorical performance sentence by sentence. The manager who assumes otherwise ends up over-preparing for a level of scrutiny that simply isn't there, polishing word choice that nobody will remember, and under-preparing for the part that actually matters, making the feedback clear, specific, and useful. Or take a new hire in their first few weeks on the job, still learning where the coffee machine is and who to ask about expense reports. New hires often stay quiet in meetings, convinced that any question they ask will be remembered as evidence they don't belong, filed away by the team as proof they were the wrong hire. In reality, experienced colleagues are typically far too absorbed in their own tasks, their own deadlines, and their own performance reviews to be building a mental file on a newcomer's every word. The new hires question, the one that felt so risky and revealing to ask out loud, usually evaporates from everyone else's memory within minutes of being asked. But here's the part nobody expects. This bias doesn't just show up in obvious, high-stakes moments like presentations or feedback conversations or a first week on the job. It shows up in the small, private rituals people build around imagined scrutiny, the quiet, everyday overthinking that never gets said out loud. And once you start looking for it, you will see it absolutely everywhere at work. Consider someone sitting in a training session, staring at a slide, covering a concept they don't fully understand. They have a question, a genuinely useful one that would probably help several other people in the room too, but they don't ask it. Why? Because they're convinced that asking will mark them, instantly and permanently, as the person who didn't get it, the one everyone quietly files away, as behind the curve. What they don't realize is that in almost every training room, several other people have that exact same question and are just as afraid to raise their hand. The moment someone finally does ask it, the reaction in the room is rarely judgment. It's relief, sometimes visible relief, because the audience isn't building a mental scoreboard of who asked what and when. Most of them are just hoping someone else asks first, so they don't have to. Or consider the employee who sends a slightly late reply, or makes a small, forgivable mistake in an email, and then spends 20 minutes drafting an apology for it. They rewrite the same 2 sentences 5 separate times, worried the recipient will pass every word choice for hidden meaning, will notice the exact phrasing, will remember this one exchange for months, as evidence of carelessness. The recipient, in most cases, opens the email once, registers the basic point in about 4 seconds, and moves on to the next item in their inbox without a second thought. The apology that took 20 minutes to perfect gets roughly 5 seconds of attention on the receiving end, if that. The gap between the effort invested in managing the impression and the attention actually paid to it is almost comic once you stop and notice it happening. Multiply that gap across a career, dozens of over-rehearsed emails, hundreds of over-rehearsed sentences before meetings, and you start to see how much time gets spent managing an audience that was never really watching in the first place. Or consider someone stepping into a leadership role for the very first time, now running meetings they used to just sit in. Every meeting starts to feel like an audition. They assume the team is scrutinizing their every decision, watching closely for the exact moment that proves they don't deserve the title they were just given. This is a large part of what people describe as imposter syndrome, and the spotlight effect is one of its main engines. The new leader assumes a level of surveillance that simply doesn't match reality. Most team members, especially in those early weeks, are far more focused on what the new leadership change means for their own workload, their own job security, and their own next project than they are on cataloging the new leader's every misstep. The scrutiny the new leader fears is mostly a story they are telling themselves in the privacy of their own head, not an accurate reflection of what the room is actually doing. Here's my personal take. Recognizing the spotlight effect is one of the highest leverage, lowest cost confidence adjustments available to anyone in a professional setting, precisely because it doesn't require becoming a different person or developing some new personality trait, just correcting one specific, miscalibrated assumption about an audience that was never paying that much attention in the first place. Recognizing the spotlight effect doesn't remove the discomfort of a mistake. The stumble still stings. The typo in the email you already sent still bothers you. What recognizing it does is change the decision that comes right after the mistake, which is where the actual cost usually lives. Picture a manager who just fumbled a key point in front of senior leadership during a big presentation. The old response, driven by an inflated sense of an audience's attention, is to spend the rest of the meeting distracted, replaying the fumble internally, contributing less because they've quietly convinced themselves that everyone in the room is still stuck on it. The corrected response looks completely different. That same manager, remembering that fewer than 1 in 4 people even register a moment like that, moves on almost immediately. They keep contributing, keep making their next point, keep asking their next question, because they know the room's collective attention has already shifted elsewhere, probably before they even finished apologizing for the fumble. The practical shift here isn't pretending the mistake didn't happen, and it isn't false confidence either. It's refusing to keep paying a tax on the mistake that nobody else in the room is actually charging you. Over time, that small shift compounds in ways that show up on a resume or a performance review. People who correct for the spotlight effect tend to speak up more often in meetings, ask more clarifying questions in training sessions, send emails without rewriting them 10 separate times, and take on stretch roles and promotions without assuming the whole company is watching, waiting for them to fail. None of that requires more confidence in some vague, abstract personality trait sense of the word. It just requires more accurate math about how much spare attention other people actually have to give you on any given day. The management takeaway is simple, and it's worth writing down somewhere you'll actually see it again. Almost every manager has a version of this story, a moment they were sure defined how the team saw them, that the team itself forgot within the hour. Most of the self-editing people do at work is calibrated to an audience that isn't paying nearly as much attention as they assume it is. Before you rehearse an apology email for the 5th time, before you stay quiet in a meeting because of a stumble from last week, before you avoid asking the question in a training session, run the math from the T-shirt study one more time. Roughly half was the guess going in. Fewer than 1 in 4 was the reality that came back. Almost nobody is watching you as closely as it feels like they are in the moment. And the sooner you build your behavior around that fact, instead of the feeling, the more of your own attention you get back for the work that actually matters. That single correction, applied consistently, is worth more to a career than almost any other confidence hack out there, because it costs nothing, and it is simply true. More of these on this channel follow along.